Welcome to the first of the innoTalks. My name is Isolde. I work at the Eindhoven University of Technology at the TU Innovation Space, and it's a center of expertise for challenge-based learning, for student entrepreneurship, an open community where students, researchers, industry, and societal organizations can exchange knowledge, develop responsible solutions to world challenges, and a learning hub for education innovation. So here we are at Innovation Origins for the first time. And actually, the innoTalks are new. This is the first time, so it's pioneering in every way. And it's inspirational interviews with experts in different areas who can inspire us and provide us with more insight in various topics. And it was actually meant to be a physical event. But well, we're happy because we can now have an absolute dream guest. And also not spending 2.5 kilograms of CO2 on a flight, because he's going to be here virtually with us. It is Neil Gershenfeld, and he's the director of the MIT Center for Bits and Atoms. It's the sister lab of the MIT Media Lab. And he's the founder of the global network with over 1,000 Fab Labs, a worldwide community of open labs where you can, well, basically make almost everything. And he chairs the Fab Foundation, he leads the Fab Academy, and plus he's involved in so many projects involving innovative solutions regarding the COVID-19 related problems. So as said, he's really a dream guest. And Neil will start with the presentation, and after the presentation, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you watch via YouTube, then write down during the presentation all the questions that arise, because that's probably what's going to happen. Write them down, because this man has so much to tell, and he talks really fast, so be there. And just put it in the chat, and we will have an eye on that. So you have the opportunity to ask questions, and we have some people also from the university that are actually live, also going to pose some questions. And well, this is actually, of course, for all the people watching live. And if you watch later, just sit back, and because I now give the virtual stage to Neil Gershenfeld.
It's a pleasure to join you. The Netherlands has a central role in Fab and Fab Lab networks I'll touch on. So I'm going to take about 15 minutes to give a quick overview of the arc of the future of making and how it relates to the pandemic, and then go into the discussion. So is my presentation being shared, or does that need to come up now? Good. So just about 15 minutes of background for the conversation. So I direct Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT. I never understood the boundary between digital and physical. And so we've done things like among the first quantum computations, cryptography in materials, logic in fluids, record-setting materials, creating synthetic life in a computer that you then boot up in a cell, early work on what became Internet of Things. That's the kind of research. And the people who have done that have gone on. Jason built all the computing infrastructure at Facebook. Rafi built all the computing infrastructure. Let's see, okay, it's updating. Rafi built the computing infrastructure at Twitter, because to do that, you can't believe that hardware and software are separate. Max started Formlabs, a $1 billion 3D printing company. Nadia, many of you know, grew up in the Netherlands and is a pioneer in machine building. These are some of the amazing people who have come through working at this digital physical boundary. To do that work, we started a lab with one of almost every machine to make anything of any size. That's what we proposed to set out originally to the NSF that they funded. And so nano, meso, micro, macro, we can make and measure. That's what let us do that kind of research. I had a problem. It would take a lifetime of classes to learn how to use them. So I started a class called How to Make Almost Anything, aimed at just a few research students. And every year, hundreds of students try to get into it. It's one of the most oversubscribed classes at MIT. But they're not there typically for research or businesses. They're there because they want to make stuff. So Kelly was a sculptor. They do projects. Her project was a device that saves up a scream when you're mad and plays it back later. This is a web browser for parrots. This is an alarm clock you wrestle with to prove you're awake. This is a dress instrumented with sensors and spine, and if somebody creepy comes close, it defends your personal space. These amazing projects that helped show, I was asking how to do digital fabrication, but not why. And they were showing that the killer app for digital fabrication is personal fabrication, not mass production, but production for a market of one person. So that then led to Fab Labs. As outreach, we thought rather than telling people what we were doing, we would give them the tools. So my lab has, think of it as tens of millions of dollar machines. Within it is a workshop of tens of $100,000 manufacturing machines. But within that are tens of $10,000 machines for rapid prototyping. And so we bundled that up and made a Fab Lab. This is one in Vestmannaeyjar, Iceland, a small volcanic island off the coast. It's about 10 machines, weighs about 2 tons, fills a big room. It includes a 3D printer, but crucially has all the other tools you need beyond the 3D printer to make complete functional systems. So boats, bicycles, furniture, consumer electronics. And we had an accident. They went viral. We didn't plan that. But from one in Boston, they started doubling. And for the last decade, they've been doubling about every year and a half. And so this is the world map of these global Fab Labs. These are some of the interesting locations, working with at-risk youth in Detroit, working with Bhutan on gross national happiness, a mixed community in Holon, Israel, with Alaska Natives, Arts Colony in Maine, Protestant Catholic Boundary in Northern Ireland. We didn't wake up with a plan for that, but every time one opens, somebody else wants one in this growing network. And then we realized the data. So up top here is the most important graph in history. This is where Gordon Moore first developed what's come to be called Moore's Law. These 5 points were the doubling of integrated circuits, and he projected a decade of the scaling of integrated circuits, their size. He got everything right except for it was 50 years. For 50 years, Moore's Law has been doubling digital computing and communication. Down here, I'm plotting 10 years of Fab Labs, and they've been doubling just like Moore's Law. And so there's more data than Gordon Moore had. And so what's rational now is to expect 50 years of the doubling of digital fabrication. That's come to be called Lass's Law. Sherry Lassiter runs the Fab Foundation and works on outreach for CBA. And she has a lot of skills, but one of them isn't being neat in her desk. And so she had a pile of papers for people wanting Fab Labs, and the pile of papers kept doubling. And that's when we had a sense that there was something like Moore's Law for digital fabrication. And so what's emerging is a 50-year roadmap. There's one Earth, thousands of cities, millions of towns, billions of people, trillions of things. In computing, this is the Whirlwind, the first real-time computer at MIT, one of those. It was commercialized as the PDP, thousands of those. Those were mini computers used to create the internet. That inspired the hobbyist computers, the Altair. There were millions of those, then billions of personal computers, and now trillions of Internet of Things. And the Nest thermostat has the power of the PDP or the Whirlwind. It's not just an analogy, it pretty much exactly can do, but it went from 1 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000 to 1,000,000,000,000, not as a metaphor, but literally. In the same way, MIT invented computerized machining in 1952, connecting a computer to a machine. The Fab Labs are descendants of that. They're like the mini computers. They're not yet personal, but they're accessible. Those are inspiring work on machines making machines, rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping, one of the things Nadia helped pioneer. That in turn is leading to not printing or cutting, but assemblers and disassemblers, digitizing the materials. And finally, that's leading to self-assemblers, where you merge the machine with the material. And so all of these are going on in a lab like mine at the same time, but they range from today to 50 years in the future, but really leading to a world of 1 trillion Fab Labs. Literally, in the same way the Nest thermostat is like 1 trillion whirlwinds. It's not 1 trillion 2-ton facilities, but 1 trillion equivalent capacity. So to keep up with that, we started a program called the Fab Academy to teach the classes in it like the class at MIT. And so here's an example of homework. Guillaume was in a lab outside Barcelona and Valdora in the hills. And he wanted food. In the beginning, all he could do is make a sketch. Then he's learning CAD, so he can start to design it. Then he's learning laser cutting, so he's making a small model. Then he's learning large format machining to make a big model. Then he's doing the plumbing. Then he's doing the instrumentation. Roundabout here, he's learning how to design circuit boards, write microcode, do surface mount rework for the brains of the system. And so we get up to his Aquaduino to run the aquaponic system. And then roundabout then, I love this next picture. Here he is with his first lettuce. And so this wasn't a startup, it wasn't a business, it was a team just learning design of hardware, software, form, function. It's literacy in these new media. And the way the Fab Academy works is it's not online, it's not in person, but it's distributed. There's local groups of students with peers and mentors and machines connected globally. And one of the flagship sites is at the Waag in Amsterdam. And in turn, the Fab Academy inspired, in fact, I believe Henk and crew are watching, so if they are, hi to them. It inspired a Fab Academy to teach textile technologies, led by Cecilia and Anastasia, and it led a bio academy started with one of the great geneticists of our era, George Church, to roughly use a Fab lab to make a bio lab and then teach biotechnology with this great recursion. So really creating infrastructure for distributed education. Now, the pandemic has been disruptive to that, but it's also accelerated change that was in our future. So in the Fab Academy, there's been a rolling cycle as the pandemic goes around the earth of labs closing, then beginning to open. And at any one time, some are closed, some are partial, some are open. But as that moves, some of the things we've been doing are creating mini kits for electronics to be done at home, creating immersive VR versions of labs to use the machines. In fact, this is a VR part of the lab in Ultimaker that was incubated at the lab in Utrecht. One is cloud laboratories. So this is students running big machines in a lab, but remotely, where you work at home, but you run the machines sort of in the cloud. And then it's driven, this is a project in Barcelona to make mini lab machines with a bill of materials of only about 100 euros, so that each student gets mini machines they can use at home. And so this combination of mini machines, remote cloud labs, and VR labs have helped us keep working through the pandemic, but they're really pushing what you need to go from thousands to millions of the labs the next year in the generation of that. In turn, the lab network has rapidly risen to the challenge of the pandemic, bringing rapid prototyping to work on it. There have been a number of very important projects doing things like making PPE, personal protective equipment, to fill crucial gaps. There's, for example, a lab, one of the labs we work with in Belgium, another in Spain. A number of labs have pioneered rapid prototyping to help respond to the pandemic. There's a video link from this session giving a tour on how the lab network is responding. To help support that, I've been running a weekly research meeting from MIT, where all the content on it is publicly available, bringing state-of-the-art research to bear on rapid prototyping for the pandemic. And so some of the projects have included validating designs for medical instrumentation. A really important one has turned out to do computational fluid dynamics to study how well PPE protects. That led to things like the face shields many people are making are actually dangerous if they don't seal the top and bottom as well as sides. This is a really interesting design for a curved crease folded face shield. Really interesting designs to do curved crease folding for isolation boxes for processes like intubation. Material testing of swabs to prove efficacy for them, nanoparticle imaging to study how filter media performs. These are all things that need state-of-the-art research labs to develop them, but then you can help deploy globally through the Fab Lab network. And so there's been a nice interplay between this project, which is aiming to fill the gap between do-it-yourself and mass manufacturing, and then this doing research to support it. I'd say the most interesting thing coming out of that is the opportunity to not just recover where we were, but really truly build back better. So we have broken economies, we have huge unemployment, we have tremendous disruption, but the traditional model is an economy equals companies creating jobs to do work for which you get money and then can buy things. But if you go into this Frosty's Lab investment era and produce something, it's not utopia, it's not free, but it bypasses that whole chain. And so decoupling consumption from creation means you can really start to revisit the foundations of how an economy works. And in recovering from the pandemic, rapid prototyping isn't just to get back where we were, but there's a real chance to build back differently. So for example, this is a lab we ran at the White House during the Obama administration. It led to this legislation to view the means to make as a kind of a right. Like we have digital computing and communication as a right. This is a sort of a human right to digital fabrication. This is Barcelona's then mayor, Trias, starting a 40-year countdown to urban self-sufficiency. Fabulous design sense in Barcelona, but over 50% youth unemployment. A whole generation can't work traditionally. And so what they started doing, led by my colleague Vicente Garrart and Tomas, who became the city architect, is putting labs all over the city as part of the infrastructure. You expect the city to take your trash and provide electricity. Now, rather than products going in one side and trash going out the other, the city has its own means to make. And Tomas Diaz has been leading a Fab City initiative of all of these other cities signing this up to this notion of cities able to produce what they consume as part of urban infrastructure. So you're connected globally for the data, the bits travel, but the atoms stay. And so I discussed that. I wrote this book with this 50-year roadmap with my younger brother, Alan, who ran the biggest video game studio at Activision, and my older brother, Joel, who ran the National Labor Relations Organization, who would hear me talk. And at this point, I would stop and people would clap and say, that sounds exciting. And they would groan because they think I'm being terribly naive about, if you go back to Gordon Moore, what he didn't anticipate was spam and fake news and income inequality and all the things that went wrong. And this was their attempt to take this 50-year roadmap, but to say we don't have to wait 50 years for them to all go wrong. We can start to think about how to shape society today. And so there's much more about what I spoke about in there. So that's a quick tour of Fab Labs making and the pandemic response. And with that, let's go into the conversation.
Thank you, Marius. For people that are thinking, who's that voice? It's not God. Well, maybe he is. It's Marius. It's of Innovation Origins. He's our director and our technician. First of all, we have a lot of questions coming in actually in the chat. We also have some questions live. But first of all, I'm just curious to know, very practical question actually, coming from the Eindhoven University of Technology, is how did MIT actually respond, like in many ways, to this, to COVID actually?
Yeah, so because of MIT has deep research connections on all sides of it, right off the bat, MIT closed down fairly early based on the data, but right away carefully protected access to campus for people doing critical response work, like the work I showed you. So MIT's had a core team on the front lines of responding to the pandemic on campus. And then off campus has been very involved in studies of things like when do you open and how do you safely open, and what is the data on managing that. And in fact, MIT just now is going into a very carefully graded opening, about 25% capacity, full of testing and measurement. And so, for example, one of the things that sounds obvious but might not be is evidence keeps coming back that the main means of propagation of the virus is aerosol particles. And so it's masks all the way down. Masks are more important than even has been conveyed. And so as MIT begins to open, it's carefully measuring health of people coming in, masks, all of that to study how to open safely. And like many other places, MIT is now deep in figuring out how we'll function in the fall, and nobody really knows for sure. In fact, for me, teaching the large rapid prototyping class, we're going to have to take lessons from the Fab Academy to figure out how we teach a hands-on class that might not be fully hands-on.
Yeah. And are you, in a way, is there an advantage? Do you see an advantage in that it's also an accelerator in collaborating, in being open source and stuff like that?
Oh, goodness. So, yeah, let's see. You said two things that are slightly different. So it's been a tremendous accelerator. There's all sorts of collaborations, both on campus that we've never anticipated. And the meetings I showed you have grown to a few hundred people meeting each week, which is pulled from leaders in government and industry and healthcare and NGOs who have never worked together and are discovering all these connections and all these opportunities. And so it's driven collaborations in a way we didn't expect. It's sort of pushed our future faster than we expected. But the second thing you say was open source, and there's been a real tension. There's been some conflict over one strand of work, like the work we're doing in the labs, has been aimed at open designs able to reproduce.
Yeah.
There's been another strand aimed at mass manufacturing, for which the open work is almost competition, that it's competing for resources. There's a risk of misinformation, all of that. And so there's been some tension between the mass manufacturing and the open source we've tried to fill. And to be clear, there's a lot of do-it-yourself stuff in response to the pandemic that was misguided, that's dangerous. There's a lot of 3D printing parts that actually are worse than doing nothing, and really need oversight, really need propagation of best practices. And so on the one side, the mass manufacturing can scale, but it can't ramp quickly. The DIY can ramp quickly, but can't scale as effectively. And part of the art has been balancing that tension to fill in the middle.
Yeah. I'm going to go to the panel and see if there's questions from our panel before I'm going to ask more questions. There was one coming in via YouTube, and that's, are you having a Fab Academy here in Holland? Well, actually, we're discussing it with Henk Buursten from de Waag to have it in Innovation Space. So that's already an answer for one of the questions that came in online. And
although, just to pause on that one. So we never expected the Fab Academy to have the role it did. So right now there's about 100 sites participating.
Yeah.
If you go to fabacademy.org, you can learn about it. We backed into it. It really is a different model. MIT is like a mainframe. You go there and get processed. Online classes are like time sharing. They're still the mainframe and you're connected to it. The Fab Academy is sort of like the internet. It's a network of campuses. Mm-hmm. Initially, it started as an outgrowth of the class at MIT. In many ways, it's racing ahead of the class of MIT now. And it really drives kind of a virtuous circle, which is it propagates best practices. It trains a collaborating cohort. And there's a lot of demand for these skills. The VAG is a flagship site in the Netherlands. There's other sites all over Europe and all over the world. You can learn about it at fabacademy.org.
Yeah.
One interesting note about it, just while we're talking about it, is to make it work, we had to invent an accreditation because nobody can accredit globally. You accredit dirt. You accredit a place, not a network.
Yeah.
But the accreditors suggested we pretend that we make up an accreditation because they didn't know how to do it. We give the made-up accreditation. But what's happening now is they're catching up. So now you can get EU ECTS credits officially recognized for our made-up accreditation because we made our made-up accreditation real, have real teeth.
Nice. Actually, I'm going to go to Ignacio. Please, Ignacio, come online.
Hi, yes, of course. Thank you, Isolde. Well, my name is Ignacio. I am a consultant at TMC here in Eindhoven, and on Friday mornings, I am a coach at the Innovation Space at TUE. Neil, I think it's really inspiring, everything that you have done. At Innovation Space, we have been trying to learn how to create this culture, this atmosphere of collaboration, and I would like to hear a little bit about that, like how to grow such a culture of cross-disciplinary thinking, not only at the university, but really also for future engineers.
So let's see, a couple of suggestions. One is to kill off design as a separate subject. And what I mean by that is there's a segregation of, you do hardware and software and physics and material science, and then you do design. And for historical reasons, everything I showed you at MIT reports into MIT through the School of Architecture and Planning, which was a historical accident because CBA grew out of the Media Lab that grew out of that. But it's also profound because when we're designing life or materials or quantum systems or spaceships, it is design, but it's design in all sorts of new means of expression. And so there's a real danger, given the fabulous design history, around Eindhoven in the Netherlands, there's a real danger to view design as segregated from science or engineering. And the work I'm showing is a kind of a new generation that's literate in these means of expression that have radically expanded. And so you want to sort of kill off design by integrating across all of these, and don't expect design to be a separate discipline from material science or embedded programming. It's design and new means of expression. And then around that, I'd say one of my favorite management tricks is ready, fire, aim, not ready, aim, fire. If you get ready and you aim and then you fire, you hit what you point at, and nothing can be surprising. You do have to get ready, and then you kind of close your eyes and fire, but then you aim afterwards by see what you hit. And so a second is to not overplan, but do the work to get ready, and then do the work after you did something without thinking too much about it to figure out what you did do. And then in turn, the heart of that is traffic, that you can't do it by yourself. You need to be clusters like the Kendall Square cluster MIT is in has spun off. It's the world's 10th economy. It falls between the economic output of India and Russia. And it's not because the people are more brilliant, it's because it functions as this kind of collaborative cluster.
I just want to pick up a little bit on this idea of like a ready, fire, aim, because one of the things that I have noticed ever since the whole COVID pandemic started is that a lot of people come with a lot of very, very good intentions and a lot of ideas, but bringing that into something actually concrete takes a lot of connections and a lot of networks, and actually knowing how to talk to people with other specialization areas who might not be such into the whole systems thinking or a holistic perspective. So I kind of just want to point out the difference between someone being already this like new generation designer and someone who can acquire the skills and the mindset.
Yeah, it helps to drive it. So in the case of the COVID meetings I'm describing, we have government regulators, we have leading industrialists, we have basic researchers, we have NGOs, we have frontline healthcare workers, all discovering that they want to talk to each other, that they didn't realize they can all help each other because they have a real reason to talk to each other. And so just in my lab at MIT, maybe a third of what we do is driven by the criteria of basic research. We're publishing in journals like Science or Nature. A third is working with like Airbus to make jumbo jets or NASA to make spaceships. But a third is working with artists and installations in developing countries and all of these other ways where we don't pose the project, do the project, and evaluate the project, but there's this really strong motivation to succeed and evaluation coming from outside of us. And one of my favorite management lessons that comes from Marvin Minsky is you can't push on a string. You can't make change happen by pushing on a string. You have to pull on a string. There has to be something pulling you forward that you entrain behind.
Oh, thanks.
I have a question with somebody that's actually live for me. Was also coming one in online. It said you talked about fixing problems before they happen. What legal and social issues do you think may arise with regard to the use of apps in mobile devices to track the spread of COVID-19? And how could policymakers deal with these legal and social issues?
Yes. The best way I can answer that is to refer you to my co-authors. And the reason I say that is I can do the high level vision of 50 years of bits to atoms. And then my core competence is like computational geometry for low level path planning. And other than that, everything else I told you, I'm reporting back, but it's not my insight. And so that's a general comment. It's not my core competence. But I will say, I have a number of colleagues who are experts in privacy and security. My former student Rafi, who built Twitter's infrastructure, then sort of reached the limit of that. He was hired to reboot computing for the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, and now he's running Laurene Powell Jobs Foundation. And he's one of the gurus on that question. And I'd say one of the main things that's emerged from it is privacy and security are fairly well understood in how to do them. It's not a moonshot. The challenge is just really getting people to use best practices. And so, there's this vision of creepy hackers who are all powerful and Big Brother invading. There's pretty good understanding of how to manage that. What is harder is the social change to just follow best practices. And among the lessons from that is, for example, security by obscurity doesn't work. It doesn't work to say this is secure because you can't peek at something. Security only works if there's complete transparency into the source of the security.
Yeah.
Or another example is there was a group in the UK that just did a really interesting job of getting healthcare data from the frontline practitioners. But the way they did it was not by pulling the data into them, but by pushing their algorithms out. So the data stays where it is locally, and they use their algorithms to go into the data. And in that case, the privacy defenders felt like this really aligned with them, was adding value while respecting it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And now I give my chair to somebody that is on a distance, of course, but it's Buster. He has a question for you. Here he is.
Hi, Neil.
Hi.
So working in the field of artificial intelligence and answering a lot of questions from people, just the general public, basically, about this. They're often very impressed about the feats that narrow AI can accomplish, and then they either think that we're already very, very close to artificial general intelligence, or we can just make it by linking together many of these narrow AI agents, whatever you want to call them. So I usually try to explain that actually us human beings are, into that regards, very efficient machines, that we can combine knowledge about many different fields and many different skills in a very small space. So do you agree on this view? And what do you think that will need to change in computer technology, and maybe also in our knowledge about physics, before we can create a computer that is as efficient in combining information as the human brain?
Good. So let me answer at 3 levels. So the first level is, I have an essay, if you search, you'll find in a collection of computing pioneers on the future of AI, where I'm very critical about the AI revolution. And the reason I'm critical is, depending on how you count, we're in the 5th boom-bust cycle of AI. So it's had 5 cycles of solving everything and then crashing and solving and crashing. And now it suddenly seems like we're in an AI revolution. But there's a completely different way to count, which is if you look at the ops per second a computer can do, the amount of data it can store, and the amount of data it can collect, those have been progressing steadily. And about 2 years ago, those matched the ops per second of a brain. And so really, the revolution in AI is not a brand new insight that the stupid people didn't know in the past and now we know now. It's scaling. That we're building computers that roughly match the capacity of a brain in ops, in storage, in data collection. And so we'd be derelict if they couldn't do something roughly as complex as a brain. So it's really important to view AI as not a sudden revolution, but as scaling. So against that so for example, I teach a class at MIT on mathematical modeling where I don't even teach AI as a separate subject. What I teach is things like function representation and search, and these underlying algorithmic concepts that are really what enable AI. So with that as background, I see 2 really interesting things coming in the future of AI. So one is, given the traditional separation between software and hardware, billions of dollars develop a computer and then it never changes. So one of the most interesting projects in my lab is we're working on developing physically reconfigurable computing systems, so that in the same way your brain physically changes as you grow and learn, to make computers that can actually reconstruct themselves. So rather than software abstracted from hardware, the software can change the hardware not as just switches in a field programmable gate array, but can actually physically reconstruct the hardware so it can grow much more efficiently to align the hardware and the software. So one of the big frontiers is breaking down this boundary between AI hardware and AI software to let them co-evolve with each other. And so that's something I'm very involved in. And then in turn, the real frontier in AI, which isn't what you expected in your question, but is at the heart of your question, is the pioneers in computing. The last thing John von Neumann studied was self-reproducing automata, a program that can communicate a computation for its own construction. The last thing Alan Turing studied was morphogenesis, how genes give rise to form. They both ended their lives studying how computation creates form. And in biology, one of the oldest parts of the genome, called morphogenes, are how evolution searches for us. The way our brains work and all our other parts work come from a search over not the body plan. Your body plan, your gene doesn't store 5 fingers. What it stores is a developmental program that produces 5 fingers. And then just like AI systems, it searches over representations of developmental programs. So it's actually doing everything we've learned about AI, but at a molecular scale. But what's interesting about that is your molecular AI runs about 10 to the 8 faster than state-of-the-art computer AI. There's the brain versus the computer have matched, but the molecular AI is many, many orders of magnitude ahead. And so one of the problems I've been most interested in is morphogenesis, how we can learn to design and compute and fabricate with this embodied AI. And so all that leads up to sort of AI has a mind-body problem because it doesn't have a body. All the things I'm describing are about embodying AI, taking it out of the cloud, and all of these things that change when you do that.
Thank you so much. How do we do this safely? Because if we're talking about embodying AI or creating some kind of agency, well, there would have to be some kind of free will involved, otherwise it can't evolve itself. So how do we do this safely?
Yeah, so I'd say there's 2 parts to that. In the work I'm describing, there are many things to worry about right off the bat. Like when a Fab Lab can make a bio lab, you can then create biotechnology, and that's scary, that's dangerous. I'm less worried in the foreseeable future about embodied AI becoming gray goo or killer robots or terminators, just because in any scenario so far, we can see that they can't run with natural resources. They're constrained to live in artificial systems because they need non-natural resources like electricity from the wall to function. The real risks comes in systems that aren't constrained to the laboratory, that can run in the wild, which is biology. And so the biological risks are among the scariest. And there, the lesson related to computer security is transparency. There's nothing that can prevent somebody from going into a dark basement and building a biotechnology lab and creating dangerous biotechnology. That's a really prevalent risk. But what we've seen is you can't prevent that. You can't legislate it. There isn't a point of control. The main thing you can do is provide incentives where you benefit by not doing it by yourself in the basement. And so we've run Fab Labs in war zones, in conflict zones, and where there's all kinds of bad stuff happening. And what we find is there aren't, people come into the labs because it's not hard to get a gun and shoot somebody. It's harder to have an opportunity to do something else. And so providing incentives to work openly rather than in secret is one of the best ways to deal with that. But it's a very different way of thinking about it. In MIT or in Eindhoven, you have a safety organization that regulates what you can do. That's a kind of command and control system, but it doesn't work in this distributed world. Power there is soft power. It's lateral alignment. You have to provide incentives for people to want to follow these rules. And the pandemic, again, is a great example. There's been lots of DIY. These weekly sessions I've been running have helped propagate best practices, not because we mandate them, but because we show the value of them.
Okay, very interesting. A lot to unpack and some research for me. Thank you.
Good.
We go to Jorge.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Neil, for your inspiring talk and questions. You mentioned about AI and the capability of AI to match the computational power of the brain. You also mentioned about the biology and the genes and expressions. And in my field, I come more from the medical field. We do tissue engineering, biomaterials. a lot of regenerative medicine. And one of the things that we're looking at this point is creating a digital twin of healthcare. Big companies like Siemens, Philips Healthcare, GE Healthcare are basically taking representation of the human heart and putting all the biochemistry, all the anatomy, physiology, the transcriptomics, genomics, everything that is all the omics to create a very nice representation of the patient's heart and do a very patient customized representation to see whether, say, the patient has atrial fibrillation, what is the best technique to treat that patient. But ideally, we would like to have our own digital twin, our own self in the digital world, and say, for example, test a lot of vaccines, the vaccines that we're doing and testing right now in the digital world, and say in a month or so, have the proper vaccines for each country or each race or whatever. That would be amazing. But the scientists that I've been talking with from these companies say, okay, we can do this in like 50 or 100 years in the future. What is your take about that?
So yeah, that question is very dear to me with a number of projects I'm involved in. One colleague, Jan Vandenbron, was in charge of math and optimization and design at Boeing. And he decided they were so broken, he went to DARPA to reinvent design, the foundations of those. And there's a project, so he's one, there's a group of colleagues at the National, and so sorry, first to relate those, in that it rests on multi-physics modeling. When you design something, you simulate it. And Jan came to appreciate that the hardest part of multi-physics modeling isn't solving the model, it's where does the model come from? Where do you find the model to solve? A group of colleagues, Jim Warren and others at National Institute of Standards, they make the machines that make the measurements standardized for the properties of advanced materials, for things like advanced manufacturing. But there the problem is you don't want a measurement from the machine, you want a model from the machine. How does a machine give you a model? Another colleague, Santanu Chaudhary at Argonne National Lab, where some of the biggest, they're actually getting the world's biggest unclassified computer, Aurora, they're on the front lines of using computers for things like the drug discovery. Again, you can use these petaflop computers to solve those models. But again, what really limits them is where does the model come from? And so what we're working on that connects all three of those is an inverse problem, which is by looking at the world, how do you learn how to model it? And in a sense, that's the whole scientific enterprise. But we're really working on kind of how you automate the discovery of models for multi-physics modeling. And so it leads to a really interesting thing. The way you're traditionally taught to build mathematical models involves partial differential equations, which is the information technology of about 300 or 200 years ago. There's nothing fundamental about them. And what's emerging is to discover physics models, you need to use a kind of representation that falls exactly between differential equations and atomic physics, where you have particles with properties that interact. And the buzz names for this are things like SPH and LBM and LGA are different names for this idea that you take the world and rather than turning it into differential equations, you decompose it into particles with rules. And then by studying these systems, you develop the rules for the particles that you can then use to forecast. And so, at the heart of your question is, we know a lot about how to simulate enormously complex systems. What's lagged behind is discovering the models. And it's a really good question for today's conversation. One more way the pandemic has driven progress is these are things my lab's been working on, but we've gone all in on them. In a lab with all the tools like mine, it's been too easy to make stuff that rather than think about it, we would just make it and test it. But the pandemic has forced us to take much more seriously how we model everything we do to not have to make it. And it's really driving this research on inverse methods for discovery of multi-physics models.
We also have a lot of questions about education. One of them is, well, working interdisciplinary is a challenge in itself. Because, you know, people talking different language, having different skills. Maybe you have some tips and tricks, and not only offline, but also online, because how do you maintain the synergy, and what are the pros and cons of actually working online?
So yeah, first, so interdisciplinary is a dangerous term because you can't be interdisciplinary without discipline. And so many years ago, when I first started visiting the Media Lab through Marvin Minsky and was working with Todd Mackover, and I was interested in electronic music, I went to an electronic music conference, and it was horrible because roughly the people there were telling the musicians they were computer scientists, and they were telling the computer scientists they were musicians, and not doing a good job at either. To be interdisciplinary is harder than not because you need to master all of the disciplines and do better than them. It's not an excuse to do worse. So at MIT, there's a sense in which quietly the departments were demoted without telling them. It used to be organized around departments, but it's been kind of turned on its side. Center for Bits and Atoms is a work group. And there's a work group for energy, and there's a work group for the brain. They're defined by questions you're interested in. In CBA's case, it's this digital physical boundary. And they're defined by styles of working. Like ready, fire, aim doesn't apply to everything, but it works well in CBA style. And so in that world, MIT gets turned on its side and is organized around these work groups for which the departments support, rather than expecting the departments to be the home. Some people fit in the department, but many more people fit in these work groups with the departments supporting them. The work groups need the departments. They need these bodies of knowledge, but you don't expect it to be the home. So one observation is just that in the collaborative work groups. How to collaborate. This is something the pandemic is pushing. So in the Fab network, once a year, we have a gathering of all the labs. It's gone all around the world. Many years ago, the VAG hosted it, and it was in Egypt last. It was supposed to be in Montreal this summer, and Bhutan next. What's emerging, and we found that people, from way before the Zoom era, we were running our own head-end video infrastructure to do video collaboration, long before it became popular. And historically, we found for the video collaboration to be successful, people needed to periodically see each other in person. So like once a year, we'd have gatherings where people would see each other. Then they went off to the video. They could then interact. That's beginning. I see that changing. So one change is it's neither going to be all online or all in person, but it's going to be blended. That things like this annual Fab gathering will have clusters of people in locations, and then we'll connect them globally. That will end up in this blended space in between. And in part, as for what we're doing today, I've only known you for a day, but it's very comfortable having a chat with you, sort of as the bandwidth, as the audio, as all of the technology improves. And there's kind of a literacy, in the early days of typewriters, it was considered rude to send somebody typewritten to somebody rather than handwritten. There's kinds of literacies emerging where the boundary between the need to be in person versus digitally is moving, and it's a combination of us socializing, but also just the resolution, the frame rate, the fidelity of the audio also improving.
And actually, I can see your background. And one of the questions online was actually, I can see this whole set of tools, materials, and 3D printers behind you. Are you still working on product development yourself? And where do you get your ideas? Do you still do it? We get an insight in you. It's different than when you would have been here and I would just see your physical body and that's it.
Yeah. So I have a Fab Lab at home. This is the clean part. The messy part in the basement is a shotbot, a large format machine, and the laser cutter, and the bandsaw and things like that. And then this is a vinyl cutter, the 3D printer, and actually, if you this is the precision milling machine. And if you had to take one, I would fight much more about the milling machine than the 3D printer, because the milling machine lets me do things like circuit boards and tooling. And then over here, where you can't see on the screen, is surface mount rework and embedded programming. And so I have a whole Fab Lab at home that I use less for any one project. I use this for the workflow development. That more than any one project, what interests me is the process development itself. And so I've got a whole lab at home I do use for that workflow. And today, this is the tons of machines that fill rooms. This is on its way to being obsolete. This is the end of an era. This is like the mini computer era. In the mini computer era, there was a rack that was a processor, there was a rack of storage, there was a rack of I/O, and it filled a room. The next generation of fab machines coming takes everything you see behind me and is really moving to merging them in one machine. And so that rather than viewing this as something to admire, view this as the end of the era of this style. But yeah, it's a whole Fab Lab at home.
And then, well, actually, we're in an era where everybody's getting more and more specialized and knowing more and more about less and less. Is also, I think, what Nathan Murford said. And then in the end, knowing a lot about nothing. If you have this specialization and then versus this uomo universalis, like you do so many things. You're also hands-on. You do so many projects. How does that relate? How's the balance?
Yeah, let's see. In the same way that, like, the trick in learning to ski is just to learn how to stop yourself from not skiing. You sort of, your instincts are right. You just have to prevent yourself from getting in the way. The analogy I would make is this doubling. So I mentioned before this number that businesses spun off from MIT are the world's 10th economy, falling between India and Russia. And it's not because the people at MIT are unusually clever. It's a productive, one way I describe it is a safe place for strange people. It's a productive environment where people like that can fit. And in this exponential growth of the Fab Labs, everywhere we open them, those people appear. The world is full. So everybody wants a knowledge economy and 21st century skills, and then proceeds to strangle it. Like, a great tip-off is milestones, the word milestone. A milestone was a marker on a road, and it means you can measure linear progress. But discovery means you have to do a random walk, and to do a random walk, you have to bias it. But if you know every step you're making, there's no room for surprise. And so the people who work that way end up being considered problem students in schools because they don't follow instructions, because they might be ahead of their teacher. They end up being bad employees because they don't like doing rote work. The world is full of these bright, inventive people who are refugees from all of these organizations creating obstacles for them. And so in part, what the Fab Lab network has done is just simply create a place where people like that fit. It's not that you need to teach people to work that way. It's that sort of the world has evolved to try to teach people not to work that way. And you have to stop doing that.
Or not.
Yeah.
There's a last person in our panel, and it's Femke. I would like to go to Femke with her question.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, we've been talking a lot about changes, and of course, a lot of things have changed due to the pandemic. And what changes you are experiencing as positive, and you would also like to keep after the pandemic?
Yeah, so that's been an arc throughout this hour. I'd say one of the things I see the pandemic doing is it's making expertise great again. It's helped highlight populist, seat of the pants declarations that just don't comport with reality. And so I'm hopeful that the pandemic has helped underscore the value of expertise. I think one of the things we've talked about in the session is it's really driving collaboration. It's taking disparate groups that didn't realize they need to be working together and realize to solve the pandemic, we need to collaborate. But I think the biggest one of my colleagues on these weekly calls I've been running through, if you go to gitlab.cba.mit.edu, you can find the notes and the videos from them, is Megan Smith. She was President Obama's CTO, and she's been really driving with a number of her collaborators this idea of build back better, where the goal is not to recover from the pandemic, but it's been credited to both Rahm Emanuel, Winston Churchill, and earlier, the notion of not wasting a crisis. But we've torn apart a lot of our institutions, and there's a real chance to build back on a different pathway. And right at the heart of today's session is it's only in the last few decades we've ended up in this world where the economy is this race to the bottom of who can make stuff cheaply. Everything is global supply chains, and sort of the economy is based around consumption. And the means of production enabling sustainable local production, it's not utopia, it's not free. But for example, a colleague, Blair Evans, who runs Fab Labs in Detroit, where there's a lot of coverage of things like bankruptcy, he's building kind of a new economy where explicitly a third of the time in the lab is for traditional economic gain, a third is post-economic for things like barter or exchange, and a third is not economic. It's things like improving yourself and your community. Or we're working with Bhutan, which is based on not gross domestic product, but gross national happiness. It doesn't mean they're all happy, but it means they measure well-being, but they bought stuff crap trucked in from India or Japan, and we're helping them have the means of production. And so in this really profound way, this whole hour of design and making is right at the center of breaking this equality of consumption and income and really sort of rebuilding society in a very different way. And the pandemic has helped demonstrate that. And there's a real opportunity to really race with that and build it. And so, one of the biggest, so this sounds like a social project, but it's a deeply technological project, is how to rebuild, how to rebuild society, but don't aim for where we were, but aim for how to build back better.
We have to, there's zillion other questions. And unfortunately, we live in this space-time. In a parallel universe, we could go on and on forever. But one question, what would you actually want to keep that came out of this crisis? Is there stuff that you actually want to maintain?
Yeah, let's see. One of the things I'm eager to keep is the kind of work group I've been working in that's been meeting weekly, of this mashup of government and big industry and startups and NGOs and researchers, and have never been collaborating this way. And that's one of the things I hope to do. One of the changes is, much as I miss being at MIT, some of what I've been doing remotely has just been more productive.
Mm-hmm. And then on a large scale, like you started fighting illiberate arts and sciences, not knowing what the battle was. You started really small, and now it grew this way. You didn't know where you were heading, but now you can look back and you extrapolate on where you're heading or where you wanted to go and where your dream is.
Yeah, so let's see, I'd say small, medium, large. First, for people listening in the Netherlands, you're fortunate because you're in one of the seats of Fab Labs and the maker movement. And so, I mentioned Vaag, I mentioned Utrecht, all over, you may have the highest access of these per capita. So if you go to fablabs.io, you'll see an index of them. Stop by, check in with Henk at the Vaag and colleagues if you need pointers. There's just a great density of these if you're not familiar, right in your backyard. I'd say there's two ways, and to wrap this up. One way to view this, to wrap up, is the scaling I showed you, 1,000 million, billion, trillion, is really serious. The era of Fab Labs is coming to a close. That's like the era of mini computers. We're going into this next one, which is like the transition to personal computers. It's not a 3D printer. A 3D printer can't make complete functional systems. It's only a little piece of that. Getting ready for the transition from thousands to millions of Fab Labs changes lots of stuff. It changes the technology. It also changes, my other brother Joel describes it as machines that make machines need organizations that make organizations. We have to change how we think about organization building. So there's a lot to come in this 1,000 million billion trillion scaling. Ultimately, the way I view this is, growing up, I had a terrible problem. I wanted to go to vocational school, and I was told I couldn't because I was too smart. And at Bell Labs, I had grievances from the union because I would try to go to the workshop, and they would say, no, you have to tell somebody what to do. And I finally came to appreciate that it was a mistake made in the Renaissance. That's when the illiberal arts were separated from the liberal arts. Liberal arts were for liberation. The illiberal arts were means of production for commercial gain. And we've been living with that mistake ever since. And so, one way to view all of this coming together is this is fixing the mistake in the Renaissance to recognize the machines behind me are means of expression. The means of expression have changed. And there's a new kind of literacy emerging around them.
Wow, that's a really nice idea. Thank you so much. I want to thank all the participants, all the people also reacted on the chat. The Innovation Origin, Marius Brugman, who was our director and a technician, and you, Neil, thank you so much for your time and effort. And as said, there's a zillion other questions, hopefully another time, but it was a dream first innoTalk. So thank you so much.
And it's my pleasure. I've been a fan of the design work from Eindhoven, and I look forward to seeing what happens when you can do design of atoms, design of life, design of spaceships, when all of your sensibility is unleashed on all of that.
You're invited, including dinner, hotel, and everything when it's allowed, but for sure. Okay. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye to everyone.
Bye.